I'm really happy to introduce Marco Cristini, that obtained his PhD in Paris, in Pisa, in Italy in 2020, and subsequently held a fellowship at the University of Tübingen and at the Istituto Italiano di Storia Antica in Rome, and currently a lecturer in medieval history at the University of Florence. Marco published a monograph on the second last Ostrogothic king, as well as several papers on 6th century Italy. And recently, you're working on a book about African Latin Christianity from the Vandalas to the Almohades. So thank you very much for coming here. And you've got exactly 20 minutes. I promise to give you 5 minutes in advance. I'll raise my hand. And I'm very, very not tolerant to longer speeches.
Okay. So thank you very much for this kind introduction. Well, if I have to add something to this presentation, I would like to add that currently I'm also looking into coins as a way to understand early medieval political communication. So it is a new line of research of mine. So before beginning, I would like also to extend my thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this conference, and especially to Professor Hen, to Professor Fauvelle, to Professor Stroumsa. I'm very excited and happy to be able to present the first results of my research on early medieval Africa here in Jerusalem. So let us begin. Around 439, a Catholic bishop, bearing the name of Quod Vuldeus, wrote 2 sermons titled De Tempore Barbarico, on barbarian times, in which he depicted the situation of 5th century Africa in dark colors. Okay. And he asked mournfully, "Where is now Africa, which was the garden of pleasures of the world? Where its regions? Where its magnificent cities?" Quod Vuldeus' sadness was not out of place, as the Roman provinces of North Africa had been invaded 10 years earlier by the Vandals, a Germanic people that had crossed the boundaries of the Western Roman Empire in the first decade of the 5th century. After lingering for a few years in Spain, the king of the Vandals, namely Gaiseric, had decided to cross the Strait of Gibraltar, and within a decade he was able to conquer Carthage. At that time, Quod Vuldeus held the office of Bishop of Carthage, and was a witness of a Vandal takeover of his city, which was accompanied by widespread killings and lootings. However, according to Quod Vuldeus, the most dangerous enemies of his flock were not enemy soldiers, but Arian heretics, who deceitfully tried to rebaptize the Catholics. The Vandals plundered most of North Africa, and they were followers of Arianism. Therefore, Quod Vuldeus' sermons have often been considered as a handy summary of Vandal rule, which was allegedly based on violence and religious persecution. In fact, Vandals have long been depicted as cruel persecutors of the Catholics by modern historiography, which mostly relies on works written by African Catholic clergymen. Although this perspective has begun to be challenged during the last few years, much work remains to be done to gain a better understanding of the main goals of the Vandal rulers and the actual impact of Arianism upon Latin Christianity. In this talk, I would like to reassess the role played by religious confrontation during some pivotal moments of Vandal history. Starting from the arrival of the Vandals in North Africa, their faith appeared to be of limited consequence at first, as evidenced by the life of Saint Augustine by Posidius, a witness of a Vandal migration in Africa, who is entirely silent on Arianism. Posidus reports that the Vandals slaughtered many priests and burnt down several churches without a single mention of their heretic beliefs. I think that this circumstance alone should give us pause, since Posidus was by no means reticent when he dealt with Augustine's struggle against heretics, as is normal in this kind of hagiographical texts. There was no reason to be silent about the alleged threat that the Vandals posed to the souls of the Africans. A similar situation occurred also with another author who is very important to reconstruct the history of Vandal Africa, namely Victor of Vita. Victor of Vita was a Catholic priest who authored a history of a Vandal persecution in Africa, covering events from 429 to 484. Victor describes the looting and arson of churches in the first paragraphs of his work, which you can read on the slide. In this paragraph, there is a quote from the Psalms, which may suggest that Victor deliberately overstated the devastation wreaked by the Vandals, in order to liken them to the enemies of God, as depicted by the Bible. However, it would be misleading to dismiss his account as mere exaggeration, since churches, basilicas, and monasteries were frequently targeted during barbarian incursions due to their wealth. For instance, St. Jerome wrote a letter in 396 that provides a detailed account of the consequences of barbarian raids. And St. Jerome wrote, "Churches have been overthrown, horses stabled at Christ's altar, the relics of martyrs dug up." End of quotation. Graves were desecrated in the hope of finding gold or jewels, while ecclesiastical buildings hosted reliquaries, liturgical objects, and money. Of course, both Jerome and Victor emphasize the sacrilegious nature of the attacks against churches, but it is unlikely that barbarian raiders had the time or inclination to target churches because they were Catholic places of worship, since their primary objective was to collect as much plunder as possible. To sum up, a work that sought to narrate the Vandal persecution of the Catholic Church was unable to offer any meaningful information about cases of religious persecution that took place during or in the aftermath of the Vandal migration to Africa. At the same time, Victor related numerous episodes which demonstrate that the Vandals were primarily interested in plunder and did not treat clergymen and other Afro-Romans any differently. The history of the Vandal persecution passes over in silence the decade between the death of Augustine, that is 430, and the occupation of Carthage, 439. As if the Vandals did not devote many resources to fight the Catholic Church in this period. Victor's narrative resumes with the conquest of Carthage and the looting of the city, which represents a hardly unsurprising move given the pattern of behavior that we have just seen. In order to remunerate his troops, Gaiseric promptly proceeded to confiscate silver, jewels, and other valuable items belonging to the inhabitants of Carthage. Nevertheless, the king knew that he had to provide his warriors with the means to sustain their families and retainers over the long term. Thus, he settled his warriors in proconsularis, roughly corresponding to modern-day northern Tunisia, not far from Carthage, where they received land that had been confiscated from the Afro-Roman provincial elites. Moreover, the Vandals needed churches for the Arian clergy, and Gaiseric decided to confiscate a few Catholic ecclesiastical buildings. The local bishops were, understandably, unwilling to cooperate, and at times stirred up the population. The logical response by the king was to issue an order for the expulsion of the rebellious bishops from their episcopal sees. It should be noted that Gaiseric did not kill or harm any of these bishops, and at least one of them was soon permitted to return to his city. Gaiseric adopted a tougher stance once the relations with the empire deteriorated following the death of Valentinian III and the sack of Rome by the Vandals in 455. From Victor's account, it appears that Gaiseric's most pressing concern was to ensure that Catholic priests and bishops did not speak against his rule, thereby fomenting rebellion, although he also targeted those who had contacts with churchmen coming from abroad, who were regarded as spies. Interestingly, the history of the Vandal persecution reports that Gaiseric forbade the ordination of bishops in the province of Proconsularis only after 457. The king had been unwilling to take this step, which represented an existential threat for every Catholic community, until the relations with the empire had been so compromised that he could not hope for a rapprochement in the short term. The fact that he limited his ban to Proconsularis indicates that his primary motivations were political, not religious. By gradually transforming Proconsularis into a predominantly Arian province, Gaiseric constructed a defensive barrier against both an imperial attack and an insurrection of his African subjects. This situation seemingly changed in 477, when Gaiseric's son, Huneric, ascended the throne. Huneric had spent several years as a hostage at the court of Valentinian III, and he subsequently married Eudocia, the emperor's daughter. As soon as Huneric came to power, he sought to address the two most pressing issues facing him, namely the relations with Constantinople and his succession. Huneric was keen to avoid a conflict with the East Roman Empire at the outset of his reign. Therefore, he sent to Constantinople some ambassadors, who portrayed him as a friend of the emperor, adding that he was favorable to the Romans, a claim that he may have sought to substantiate by authorizing the African clergy to create a new bishop of Carthage. Victor reports that Huneric initially demonstrated considerable leniency towards the Catholics, whereas he persecuted the Manichaeans instead, many of whom were said to be hidden among the Arian clergy. Scholars have long noticed that these measures were connected with the fact that Huneric had resolved to designate his son Hilderic as his successor. The king was well aware that the crown should go to his nephew Gumtamund, according to the law of agnatic seniority established by Gaiseric. But Huneric could not afford to exclude his son from the succession, at a time when the young Hilderic may have claimed the inheritance of the Western Empire. However, Huneric had to face widespread opposition, which resulted in a ruthless purge. He executed the wife and son of his brother, exiled other members of the royal family, and went so far as to burn the Arian patriarch at the stake. In the meantime, the Catholic see of Carthage had been transferred to Eugenius, possibly a local priest. The return of a Catholic bishop to the capital of the Vandal kingdom aroused the hostility of the Arian clergy, and Huneric was caught between his desire to maintain cordial relations with the empire and the need to retain the loyalty of the Arian Church following his removal of numerous individuals from its ranks. Consequently, he took the first measures against the Catholics and claimed as his own the possessions of all Nicene bishops who had passed away. Subsequently, he enacted a decree stipulating that the successor of a deceased bishop could not be ordained until he had made a payment of 500 solidi to the treasury. However, the situation took a turn for the worse in May 483, when Huneric promulgated an edict in the presence of an envoy of Emperor Zeno, and sent it to all Catholic bishops of his kingdom, asking them to come to Carthage in February 484 and discuss their faith with the Arian bishops. The Council of Carthage appears to be a carefully orchestrated propaganda strategy with the aim of flattering the Arian bishops and exerting pressure on Emperor Zeno by using tolerance as a bargaining chip, probably with the aim of convincing Constantinople to recognize the young Hilderic as the legitimate heir to the Vandal throne. What followed is an intricate and comparatively quick series of developments, which scholars have been discussing for more than a century. As it would be too long to dwell on all the details here, I will now offer a very brief overview of how events unfolded according to my reconstruction. A fuller account is included in my forthcoming book about African Christianity, which I will be happy to share with you if you are interested. So, all Catholic bishops living in territories under Vandal rule convened in Carthage in early 484. The debate was preceded by acts of intimidation, including the condemnation of a learned Catholic named Letus to the stake, and the separation of bishops from each other. The discussion between Nicene and Arian, prelates got off to a bad start and soon descended into chaos, among shouting and reciprocal accusations. Victor reports that the Arian bishops misled the king, claiming that their opponents had incited the crowd to disrupt the council. Huneric resolved to close all Catholic churches throughout his kingdom and transfer their properties to his own bishops. Moreover, he prohibited Catholics from holding any office at the court or in the provincial administration, unless they accepted to embrace Arianism by the 1st June 484. The bishops who had convened at Carthage were promptly expelled from the city. However, Huneric did not immediately exile them, as he permitted them to linger near the walls for a while before proposing a compromise, and this point is crucial. Should the bishops have assented to the terms of a document the king had prepared, Huneric promised that they would have been reinstated in their sees. The document read as follows: "Swear that, after the death of your lord the king, you wish his son Hilderic to be king, and that no one of you will send letters to lands across the sea. For, if you give your oath concerning this, the king will restore you to your churches." The intimidation of the bishops, the Council of Carthage, Huneric's edict, and the subsequent seizure of ecclesiastical properties led to this proposal in a crescendo of threats that is hardly casual. The king had not hesitated to kill his own relatives to ensure that his son could succeed him. Therefore, it is unsurprising that he tried to force the Catholic clergy to accept Hilderic as their future king. Those who refused to obey the king found no mercy, because according to Victor, almost 5,000 members of the Catholic clergy were exiled to territories controlled by the Moors, which they reached after a terrifying march. All these measures and the cruelty of Huneric towards the bishops were aimed, in my opinion, not at achieving a complete conversion of the Afro-Roman population to Arianism, but at ensuring that the son of Huneric, namely Hilderic, could ascend the throne. So the main aim of Huneric, in my opinion, was not religious, but political. Now, I pass over quickly the following period, which is less interesting, and I come to the conclusions. So, in spite of their fame as persecutors, Vandal rulers dealt with their Catholic subjects on an ad hoc basis and were not overly influenced by their religious confession, since political expediency played a more important role on multiple occasions. To be sure, conversions to Arianism were considered as proof of loyalty, and Catholic elites were subjected to harsh measures from time to time. But the length, geographical extension, effectiveness, and ultimate goals of these outbursts of violence should be reconsidered and, most importantly, studied in a diachronical perspective, since the attitude of Gaiseric was much different from that of his son Huneric and his successors. To return now to the opening of this paper, the two sermons of Quod Vult Deus I mentioned are titled De Tempore Barbarico, on Barbarian Times, in the manuscripts. But this expression occurs nowhere in the writings of Quod Vult Deus, and it may well have been coined by a later scribe, possibly the same scribe who, mistakenly, attributed these sermons to St. Augustine. Thus, it is by no means sure that the Bishop of Carthage regarded his age as barbarian times. Furthermore, Quod Vult Deus mentions Vandals and Arians in different parts of his sermons, which begs a question. Are we sure that the Arians who, according to Quod Vult Deus, tried to rebaptize Carthaginian Catholics were Vandals? In other words, should we categorically exclude that these Arians might have been Arian Afro-Romans who took advantage of the arrival of the Vandals to freely profess and preach their faith? With these admittedly unsettling questions, I conclude, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this really interesting talk and leaving us with these 2 or 3 big questions at the end. I suggest that we take questions now, or is that okay? I think because the papers are quite different. So I'm opening the floor. Does the person who has a question need to come here? Oh, you have okay. Yes, please, Sarah, and then...
Thank you. This was really illuminating and very interesting, and I admit very new to me. From the perspective of the later Muslim theology, I encounter very few references to the Arian dogma, but often what we hear is connection to the Donatists. And I wondered if you would be willing to say a few words about the Donatists in this picture.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for your question. Well, the question of the Donatists under Vandal rule is a much discussed one, because, as you know, Donatism was very widespread before the Vandals came to Africa, so at the times of St. Augustine. At the beginning of the 5th century, Donatism was officially condemned by the imperial authorities, and there was a kind of persecution of Donatists. But several Donatist communities remained in Africa during Vandal times. It is not, it is unknown whether these communities were happy of a Vandal takeover of Africa or not, because many scholars think that the Vandals had a less confrontational attitude, a less harsh attitude towards these communities because they were not Catholic, they were enemies of the Catholic. But on the other hand, we have also a couple of sources that seemingly indicate that the Vandals at a certain point also persecuted the Donatists, apart from the Catholics. So it is unclear. What we know is that at the end of the 6th century, so after the fall of the Vandal kingdom, there were seemingly still Donatist communities in Africa, because Gregory the Great is speaking of these Donatists. But it is far from clear whether these Donatist communities were the same as the Donatist communities of Augustine, or, as I think it is more likely, the term Donatist was applied to local Catholics who were not in agreement with their bishops and with heritage. So the label of Donatism, in my opinion, and not only my opinion, came to indicate a kind of heterodox African Christians and was not strictly connected with previous Donatism. As far as the Arabs are concerned, I think that the question of Donatism is more important because possibly the Arabs relied on works written possibly by St. Augustine or by 4th or 5th century Catholic authors who wrote a lot about Donatism. Only later authors in Africa wrote about Arianism. So possibly the Arabs had access to Christian materials which was more focused on the battle against Donatism than on the battle against Arianism. But I don't know what sources the Arabs had when dealing with Catholic theology. So it would be interesting to look into this.
Thank you so much. So what I want to say, I want to ask you a question about, have you ever tried to take into account all the French colonialist period, I mean, all the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, who used to say that the Vandals were the worst, they were the bad, with a very bad reputation, as you can imagine, in order to say that, to emphasize, to point out the fact that the Vandals used a key role, a decisive role, in order to, what to say, the failure to convert all North Africa. This is what I mean. Yeah. And maybe you're trying to do something else to say that Vandals, they were not so bad, there is something else. So what do you have to say about that?
Well, okay, so yes, the Vandals were widely used by the historiography of the 19th and early 20th century to demonstrate that the classical civilization, so to say, had come to an end in more or less the 5th century. So they were used to show that the Roman past was ended in this period, and of course then the French, in their view, tried to regain Africa for Christianity and for the Western civilization with their invasion and with the colonization of Algeria, Tunisia, and so on. So the Vandals were part of this strategy of political communication by the French authorities. This said, these ideas exerted a lasting influence on historiography also beyond the colonial period. Also works written in the 1990s still adhere to these ideas of the Vandals as persecutors, as enemies of the local population, and so on. To be honest, there were some attempts to confute these ideas already in the second half of the 20th century. But they were not much accepted by historiography. So nowadays these ideas are fortunately not widely accepted anymore. But I think that there is still the need to look into a few of these key points, pivotal moments of Vandal history, because, for instance, the persecution of 484 is still mostly regarded as an attempt by King Huneric to achieve religious consistency, uniformity within his kingdom. Whereas I think that his persecution is mostly an attempt to obtain the recognition of his heir as his legitimate successor. So religion was important, but up to a certain point. His main motivations were political. This is just an example. There are quite a few other points that need to be, in my opinion, treated better, because we are still much influenced by this idea of Vandals as persecutors, but we have to reassess the impact that their alleged persecutions had on the history of Africa in this period and on the political activity of Vandal rulers.
Okay, Thank you very much. One last question, someone open?
Thank you very much. So I'm just wondering, this conflict you described, this political, religious conflict, was it limited to the elites, the bureaucratic, religious, political, military elites, or did it affect the wider population?
Well, thank you. Good question. I try to keep my answer short. In Victor Vita, you find both instances of conflict at a high level of society and also among common people. For instance, the Vandals at a certain point tried to rebaptize also farmers, peasants. But this was, in my opinion, an attempt of forced conversion, which was not supported by the court. It was an attempt supported by local priests and local Vandal landlords who used religious coercion as an instrument to better control their peasants and their farmers. But we see that this confrontation between Catholics and Arians was widespread at all levels of society, at least according to Victor of Vita and the other Catholic sources. Of course, we have to rely on our sources because we cannot interview the protagonist.